Hey, what's up, guys? This is Shayan, and today we'll get to learn about the Solow Growth Model. So let's just dive into it. Really important and surprisingly straightforward concept in economics. So I picked this model because it really explains the big picture, how countries grow over time, what helps them get richer, and where things can stall. This model helps us answer one of the biggest questions in global economics. Why are some countries rich and the others poor? So I know that sounds huge, but by the end of the presentation, you'll see how a few simple ideas like saving money, investing in technology, and managing population can explain a lot of the differences in income and development across the world. So moving on, yeah, so why should we care about the Solow model? The three main reasons. It's powerful. It gives us a solid framework to understand how economies grow in the long run. It's explanatory. It can actually explain 40 to 60% of the income differences between countries using things we can measure, like capital and savings. It gives us guidance, especially for developing countries. It tells policymakers what levers to pull for sustainable growth. And it's not just theory, it's practical as well. So let's talk about how the model is built. At the center, we have the equation, which is y equals AF bracket K comma L bracket closed. So that's just a fancy way of saying output depends on technology, capital, and labor. A couple of key ideas. Diminishing returns means as you add more capital, like machines or factories, you get less and less extra output. And capital doesn't just grow on its own, it grows through savings and wears down through depreciation. So the more a country saves and reinvests, the more capital it builds. But it has to be balanced that with how fast capital wears out. Now to the fourth slide. So to keep things simple, economists often look at everything per worker instead of the whole economy. So here's what that looks like. Y equals to A into F. Output per worker, meaning output per worker depends on capital per worker and technology. And the second equation you see in the capital accumulation. Capital, which means capital per worker, grows based on how much we invest minus depreciation. And the third one, the steady state condition. The steady state, this is where capital per worker stops changing. That's where the economy kind of, levels off unless there's progress in technology. And the three key drivers in this model is savings, population growth, and depreciation. Now, to the next slide. All right, let's bring it all together with the Solow graph. This is super important, so let's take it a bit slow. So even if you didn't understand what happened before, the graph can explain everything right now. So please be very attentive towards it. So on the y-axis, on the x-axis, we've got capital per worker. On the y-axis, we've got output per worker. Now let's add the curves. So the production curve, this is y equals to f. It shows how much output we get from each level of capital per worker. The investment curve, it's just saving times output, S into F. This shows how much output is being reinvested. And the depreciation line is N plus delta into K. It's a straight line showing how much capital we lose due to wear and tear and population growth. And the magic happens where the investment curve and the depreciation line intersect. That's the steady state. And at this point, the economy stops growing in capital per worker unless technology improves. I hope you all got that. Okay, so so this is just a theory. It actually works in real life. The Solow model can explain 78% of development differences between countries. Now that is huge. So let's take South Korea. They've had 33% saving 33% of saving rate, which helped them grow faster than countries with lower saving rates. So now in the US, 60% of the economic growth since 1950 has come from, well, you guessed it, technology. That's the A in our equation. So both capital and technology matter a lot in the Solow model. Now, let's put this into a side-by-side comparison. Okay, United States, $80,000 GDP per person, 22% saving rate, high-tech and educated workforce. Nigeria, 2,200 GDP per person, 9% saving rate, and less advanced tech and lower human capital. Now, here's the cool part. The Solow model can explain about 40% of that gap just through differences in savings and capital. The rest that comes from basically differences in technology and education, what we call human capital. Now, policy implication. So what does the model suggest? Countries, what does the model suggest? What should countries basically do? Investment in technology. That's the only way to push past the steady state and keep growing. Focus on education because smarter workers are more productive and drive innovation. Manage population growth. Too much growth can spread capital too thin. Encourage smart savings, enough to build capital, but knowing it won't fuel growth forever on its own. That's where you need to be. It's about balance, basically, and making the right long-term investments. Okay, so now let's talk about strengths and limitations. All right, so we've talked about how the Solow model is, how it works, and even how it implies in the real life. But no model is perfect, right? So let's be honest about both the strengths and limitations of this one. So the first strength, it's simple, which is honestly a big deal in economics. It gives us a clear way to understand long-term growth using measurable things like capital, savings, and labor. And it helps explain a big chunk, like 40 to 60% of the income differences between countries. That's like really powerful. But now the limits. The model treats technology as something that just magically improves over time. It doesn't explain how that happens. It just assumes it does. It also ignores human capital like education and skill, which we know are major drivers towards growth. And finally, it's kind of hands off when it comes to government or institutions. It assumes they don't matter, which we know isn't true in the real world. So, yeah, that's a solid starting point, but not the full picture. So let's just wrap this up. So the Solow model gives us a smart, simplified way to understand how economies grow over time. It tells us savings help build capital. Population growth can spread capital too thin. Depreciation slows us down, and technology, that's the real long-term driver of growth. It explains a lot, but it doesn't explain everything. To really understand the development, we also need to consider things like education, innovation, systems, good governance, and global trade. But even with its limits, the Solow model is still one of the best tools we have for understanding why some countries succeed economically and others struggle to catch up. So if you're building policy, studying development, or just curious about how economies work, this model is a fantastic place to start. Now, that's the Solow model for you, the simplified, humanized, and a relevant for today. So, whether you're a student, a policymaker, or just someone who's curious about how the world works, this model gives you a lens to understand economic growth with just a few key ingredients. Now, thank you so much for listening. And if you learned something, let me know. Thank you so much.